Good morning, brethren. It's just wonderful to be together around the word of our Lord Jesus Christ, to be in His presence, to be able to worship as a family, to be comforted that despite us being so far apart, we are joined by one Spirit that helps us. This morning's topic is one that has always almost hounded me, and I suppose you, for a long, long time. And that's the feeling of feeling inadequate. I think when one looks at what we are facing at the moment, we feel inadequate to render commentary. We feel inadequate to assist adequately. Our children feel inadequate in their preparation for exams because of the disconnect between teacher and pupil. We feel inadequate as parents because now we are pushed into situations where we are not trained, and that is to supervise our children in their education and help them to be able to prepare adequately so that they can give an account in those accountability sessions, namely examinations. I heard a wonderful story the other day, which I want to share with you, is of a young boy named Nick. He was 5 years old and he was in grade R, and he was at school for 2 weeks. And so he walked in this one particular day very proudly and stated that he was the smartest child in the class. His grandmother, of course, was very proud of Nick and asked him if this is what the teacher said. And maybe that Nick could explain to her why the teacher said that. And Nick says, "No, ma'am, I had to tell him that I'm the smartest kid." I suspect that we all know that we've been around people that know that they are somebody special. But Paul writes a letter to the church in the book of Romans, chapter 12, verse 3, and then he speaks to the church and says, "For I tell you, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think." And over the years, as you and I know, we've known of many Christians who have not thought very much, or rather thought very little of themselves. We also know of Christians that thought too highly of themselves. I will never forget a sermon that Stephen Leibrandt did on the life of Gideon. He spoke of this young man that was asked by God and tasked by God to lead the Israelites in a battle against God's enemy. Gideon's response to God was, "How can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my father's house." That is in Judges chapter 6, verse 15. In other words, he's saying to God, "I'm sorry, God, you got the wrong cat here. I'm a nobody. I've always been a nobody. I can't do that. Don't you want to find someone else that is better qualified than I am?" I think we all have and can relate to the situations like this, where we feel that we are not good enough. We feel that we have made too many past mistakes. We've been hard on ourselves. We've crucified ourselves, and when people criticize us, we tell them to calm down because we're doing a good job in and of itself. Madison Somnier made a comment and said, "On an almost daily basis, I meticulously look for evidence that I'm a nobody, that I don't deserve to be loved, or that I'm not living up to my full potential." It's amazing that we watch even in our adverts that are displayed, that so often we are suggested just how we can become adequate. I've watched an advert of a vitamin tablet where there's a guy running and he's chasing a train. And another lady that chooses not to get onto the elevator, but to get into the staircase and run up to the top, to which my wife often said, these people have got issues. Or sometimes we compare ourselves to someone who is financially successful, and we ask the question, what's wrong with me? Why don't I have what he or she has? Or maybe you as a young student today is saying that I study every single day and all I can make is B's and C's. And I know a friend of mine that doesn't even crack a book and he gets straight A's. Or maybe you feel inadequate that you're sitting in a Bible study and suddenly the facilitator of the Bible study would refer to a passage and someone in the back corner would say, that reminds me of 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 14. And in your mind, you're saying, I didn't even know Chronicles existed. Or maybe somebody prays and the person prays so well that you feel, wow, that is a good prayer. I didn't even know how to pray. You see, I'll never forget the day my daughter was born, and I stood in the hospital of Somerset West Hospital, and I thought, the best thing that I've ever cared for was a dog. And now I've got to take care of a child. Sue and I were very young, and suddenly we felt inadequate. I'll never forget the day when I rebuked a young man for sin in his life. I spoke to him about what he was doing and what I saw happening in his life. And I'll never forget his comment to me was, he said, "You're a joke." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Do you know how much I earn?" And I said, "Well, I don't think that was at discussion." He said, "We find you quite humorous. Last night we had a good joke about you, and I laughed with my friends over a beer, telling them about this poor preacher that's coming to rebuke me about my life." Well, I don't think it is important to tell you what I responded to him. But what I want to say to you is that so often, even in serving, in preaching, and I know in whatever profession you might be, you feel at times that you are out of your depth. So many of us struggle with these feelings of inadequacies. Because over and over in this letter, we find that Paul writes to the church and he speaks to them about exactly that, about his inadequacy as an apostle. Over and over again, he speaks about how weak he feels. Chapter 11, which Johann read, he says, "Who is weak and I am not weak? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that shows my weakness." Chapter 12, "I will boast of the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities." 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9 through 2. I want you this morning to listen to the overview of 2 Corinthians and watch this clip as we both listen to an overview of the book of 2 Corinthians. Harry? 2 Corinthians, the clip.
Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Even though it's called 2nd or 2 Corinthians in our Bibles, there are multiple clues within this letter that it's not the second thing he ever wrote to the church of ancient Corinth. Paul started this Jesus community in Corinth some time ago. On one of his missionary journeys, you can read the story in the book of Acts, chapter 18. And after moving on, Paul got a report that things were not going well there. So he wrote the letter that we call 1 Corinthians to correct these problems. And it appears that many in the church rejected Paul's teaching in that letter and rebelled against his authority. And so we learn in this letter that Paul had followed up in person with what he calls the painful visit. And after that, he sent a letter which he says was written with anguish and tears. And so after all these measures, most, but not all of the Corinthians realized their arrogance and they apologized to Paul. They wanted to reconcile. And so Paul wrote this letter to assure them of his love and commitment. The letter's been designed with 3 main sections, each addressing a distinct topic. So Paul first finalizes his reconciliation with the Corinthians. Then in chapters 8 and 9, he addresses the topic of forgotten generosity. And in the final chapters, Paul challenges the remaining Corinthians who still reject him. Let's dive in and you'll see how it all works. So Paul opens up by thanking the God of all mercy and comfort, who brought peace and encouragement to him and the Corinthians during this time of division and dispute. He acknowledges that things have been tense since this painful visit, and he makes clear he's forgiven them. He wants an open and honest relationship. But why had they rejected Paul in the first place? Well, we discover later in this letter that the Corinthians had disregarded Paul as a leader. He was poor, he earned a meager living through manual labor, he was under constant persecution and suffering, he was often homeless, and to top it off, he wasn't a very impressive public speaker. And so once the Corinthians were exposed to other, more wealthy, impressive Christian leaders, they started to think less of Paul. They were actually ashamed of him. So Paul responds first by showing that their elevation of these leaders, simply because of their wealth and eloquence, is a betrayal of Jesus. It shows a totally distorted value system. True Christian leadership, Paul says, is not about status or self-promotion. Paul depicts himself and the other apostles as captive slaves to King Jesus, who's leading them on a procession of triumph. Paul's job isn't to be impressive, but rather to point people to the one who is Jesus. He then alludes to a recent demand of the Corinthians that he provide some letters of recommendation to prove his authority and credentials. And this is ridiculous to Paul. Their church wouldn't even exist if he hadn't started it. And so he says they are his proof of genuine leadership. They are his letter of recommendation. He cleverly quotes from the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, saying that God's Spirit has written his letter of recommendation on their hearts as his new covenant people. The Corinthians shouldn't need any more proof than that. Now, the mention of the new covenant, it leads Paul into a long comparison between the old covenant between God and Israel that was mediated by Moses and the new covenant between God and the Corinthians mediated by Jesus and the Spirit. The old covenant made at Mount Sinai, it was truly glorious. It made Moses himself shine with God's glory, but that glory eventually faded. Not to mention the fact that the laws of that covenant were ineffective at truly transforming Israel. But the new covenant, by comparison, is even more glorious because the resurrected Jesus is the very glory of God and he lives on forever. And it's his Spirit that's now transforming people to become more faithful, just like Jesus himself. Now, this all sounds amazing. I mean, who doesn't want to share in God's own glory? But Paul goes on to show how the paradox of the cross turns upside down the Corinthians' ideas of glory and success. After all, Jesus' glorious exaltation as king took place through his suffering, execution, and death. On the cross, Jesus revealed God's salvation. He died for the sins of the world to reconcile people to God. But the cross does even more. It reveals God's character. He's a being of utter self-giving, suffering love that seeks the well-being of others. The cross also reveals a new cruciform way of life. And Paul's goal is that his life and ministry imitates the cross. So although his apostolic career, it's been marked by humility, suffering, by poverty, it was all to serve the Corinthians. And so when they disapprove of Paul's poverty and suffering, they disapprove of Jesus too. Paul's way of life and leadership is actually the proof that he authentically represents the crucified and risen Jesus. Paul really wants to reconcile with the Corinthians, but he won't let things lie until they've been transformed and embrace this upside-down paradox of the cross. After this passionate appeal, Paul moves on to address the topic of forgotten generosity. So the Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem, they had fallen into poverty due to a famine. And Paul was raising money among the new churches that he started, full of mostly non-Jews. They would all send a relief gift as a symbol of their unity in the Messiah, Jesus. And so many of his churches, they were thrilled to give, but the Corinthians, in the midst of all this conflict with Paul, hadn't saved up for the gift. And for Paul, this isn't just about money. It's another sign that the Corinthians have not been transformed by the gospel about Jesus, which at its heart is a story of generosity. Paul says, "You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus the Messiah, that even though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich." He's telling the story of the gospel through financial metaphors. Jesus gave up his glorious honor or wealth, and he lowered himself to die like a poor slave, so that other people who are impoverished through sin and death can be exalted and become wealthy through the riches of God's grace. To be a Christian is to let this story sink deep into your mind and heart, letting it transform you into someone who's more generous, more willing to share your life and resources to help others. In the final section of the letter, Paul focuses on the main source of his conflict with the Corinthians, that group of impressive leaders that he sarcastically calls super apostles. So they came to Corinth promoting themselves and bad-mouthing Paul as a poor, unsuccessful leader. And at the risk of sounding self-promoting, Paul says, do these guys really want to compare credentials? He can totally take them on. Are they Jewish Bible experts? Well, so is Paul. He was a Pharisee, for goodness sakes. He has the whole Bible memorized. Do they want to brag about their superior knowledge of Jesus? Paul has actually seen and hung out with the risen Jesus. He's actually had visions of Jesus' heavenly throne room. But more importantly, Paul has given his entire life to the mission of Jesus. He sacrificed comfort and stability, and he never asked the Corinthians for money. Unlike the super apostles who charged a lot, Paul earned his own living. But, Paul says, he refuses to brag about these accomplishments because these aren't the things that really matter as a Christian. Instead, what he'll brag about is how flawed and how weak he is, because it's in those inadequacies that he discovers the love and mercy of Jesus. Or as Jesus once told Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect through weakness." Paul concludes the letter with a sober warning to the Corinthians. They need to check themselves. Their contempt for Paul, his way of life, their love for these super apostles, it all shows that they don't grasp who Jesus is on a fundamental level. They're not living like transformed followers of Jesus, and so he invites them once again to humble themselves before the love of Jesus. 2 Corinthians gives us a really unique window into the life of Paul and the paradox set before us by the cross of Jesus. The cross challenges our values, our ways of seeing the world. We value success, education, wealth, but God values humility and weakness because his love and power were made known through the suffering, death, and the resurrection of Jesus. The cross also unleashes the transforming power and presence of the Spirit to empower Jesus' followers to take up his cruciform way of life and make it their own. And that's what 2 Corinthians is all about.
I'd like for us to start by asking a simple question. As you've seen the overview, he deals with a paradox that is found in the gospel of Christ, that he will take a non-starter, a nobody, and make them a somebody. The same way that Paul would rebuke the church in the beginning of the book of 1 Corinthians, he tells him this truth: who of you have been who you are had it not been for Jesus? The first question I want to ask you, why do you feel the way that you do feel? And there are primarily three reasons why we do feel inadequate. First of all, our feelings of inadequate may be as a result of some unfair criticism. We think of the Apostle Paul as a sort of a super apostle, and none of us would dare to criticize him or speak badly of him because we know his sheer proximity to Jesus. But we find that Paul was criticized constantly. In chapter 10, he says, "For they say that his letters are weighty and strong, but his bold bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account." 2 Corinthians 10:10. The NIV translates it and says, "In person he's unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing." You see, I don't think there's anything else that anybody needs to say that could make you feel not only inadequate, but totally useless. In a way, they're telling him that you are no good, you are pathetic, you'll never amount to anything. And I wish you were more like your brother or your sister. And we're not quite sure if you've ever had to listen to that kind of criticisms from family or friends. But internally, these messages are driven and written on the hard drive of our memory. And they are stored up. And they replay and tap us on the shoulder every single day of our lives, saying, I'm not adequate. I'm not capable of doing this. The second reason we feel inadequate, and this may surprise you, because it could be the result of some unrealistic compliments. People may say to you, you are the best. You're amazing. No one is as good as you. And inside you are thinking, but I don't know who you're talking about. You don't know me. You do not know how I struggle in my own life. You will not know just how much I struggle just to get rid, talking from a young person's perspective, with my looks and my face. Back in the day when we were growing up, we were all encouraged to win trophies. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't work hard to be praised and given accolades. But here at the end of the day, we find that when you have graduated, people frankly will not care whether you went through kindergarten. But sometimes we find that children who are praised unnecessarily and continually to try to give them a good sense of self-esteem, despite their performance in their development, it gives them a false sense of certainty and of character development. Politicians sometimes we find have those. There was a politician of the SABC, and he claimed to be the most brilliant business person that has ever graced the halls of the SABC. We listen to politicians making assertions, and we ask the question, where do you get that? But because their accolades have been sung, people believe. Isn't it amazing? It reminds me as a child, the book that I read called The Emperor's New Clothes, where he was supposedly the best garment was given to him, and it was sewn by the finest seamstresses and the finest tailors. But the key behind all of this was that that particular clothes was invisible and could only be seen by a select few. Then he put his garment on, this imaginary garment, and he walked down the parade ground with no clothes on. And as he walked, many people looked at him and said, hang on a minute, you've got no gear on. And then they were silenced. And those who were sycophants would say, it's absolutely beautiful. Your robes are amazing. And so we watch this delusion going on in our world. The third reason we feel inadequate is because the biggest problem is that we all have a tendency to compare ourselves to everybody else. We look at other people and we say, I do not measure up to those people. I'm not as attractive as he or she is. I'm not as intelligent as he or she is. I'm not as talented as he or she is. And mass media doesn't help very much. In fact, it makes it worse. The world portrays those who have made it as celebrities and superstars. And yet we know for a fact that there's some serious chapters in their life and the overall story of their life that we are not privy to. Facebook doesn't help much, because what it does is it deepens the idea of inadequacy. Isn't it amazing? We upload our picture of a wonderful dish and a meal that we are sitting with and a beautiful lobster dinner that we're having on a coastal town in Puerto Rico or in somewhere on the coast of Spain or on Croatia. Many times other people look at this and they say, I have never in my life been there or had a meal like that. And what makes it worse, the person starts looking around and saying, I've only got 172 followers where my friend has 912 friends. Stephen Furtick has right when he says, we compare others' highlight reels with our behind the scenes. In other words, we get on those Instagrams and those platforms and we start looking at just how wonderful everybody else's life is. We do the same with our children. And we look at our children and we say, look at how perfect your children are and look how imperfect mine are. My kids' socks don't even match. Yet I watch every single week how your kids change into brand new garments. Inadequacies deepened. Paul himself was plunged into comparing himself as a preacher to other preachers. There was a group of preachers in Corinth when Paul left, and clearly they were spreading rumors about Paul. They were undermining and questioning his legitimacy as an apostle. They started to say to him things that he wasn't part of the original 12, like Peter, James, and John. It also appears that they would have accused him of lying about the vision that Jesus on the road to Damascus. They tried to convince the Corinthians that they were the true apostles, and that if Paul was the apostle, he would have looked the part. And that is why they would say to him that his presence is not even that of an apostle, and certainly not his speech. And Arthur's rendition, and also church fathers writing of our brother Paul, speaks that he had a large head, he was bandy-legged, and he was quite short. And in all stretch of the imagination, we watch how they could have deprecated this man and could have despised him and undermined him purely by physical appearance. And no wonder we find that Paul is a bit defensive in this letter. But then Paul writes down and he looks at all of this and he says, you know what? Truthfully speaking, you are right. I am a loser. Yes, I do not have the fancy credentials that all of you had. In fact, I had to run out of Jerusalem. In fact, I don't have a fancy car or a big church. The truth is, wherever I go, I'm thrown out of their cities and their synagogues. I'm beaten within an inch of my life. And yes, it's true that I'm really not worth anything by your estimation. And Paul would say to them, I'm afflicted, I'm perplexed, I'm persecuted, I'm struck down. I'm not like all of those flashy, fancy preachers. And here's the thing. He says, I'm afflicted, but I'm not crushed. I'm perplexed, but not driven to despair. I'm persecuted, but not forsaken. I'm struck down, but not destroyed. And here, I want to speak to Piet. Piet, you are lying in bed, and although you are sick, you are not struck down. God can raise you up. Here's the key in 2 Corinthians 4:7. And I know that many of us are weaker and we're getting older. He says, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and does not belong to us. And Paul doesn't say, look at me, my life is perfect. I've got it all together. Look at what a great job that I am doing. Or you need to listen to me. Rather, he's saying, yes, you're right. The truth of the matter is I am afflicted. I am perplexed. I am persecuted. I am struck down. My relationship with God and my calling into the ministry did not come without pain and suffering. But what it has done has given me the strength to do and to serve Him so that His character will define me rather than a character that I've carried through my secular life or pre-Christ life. Verse 10, Paul says, we also carry around the death of Christ in our bodies so that the life of Jesus is also shown in our bodies. They're saying that as Christ suffered, so I'm suffering. And the reason I do it so that there is a direct correlation with the life of being a follower of Jesus rather than a super apostle. Salvation through Christ, and I love what Laurie said, is a mediated process that helps you and I through suffering, understanding that you're not alone, that you can experience the most disparaging difficulty with integrity and hope, because that's what Jesus did. He never ever surrendered his identity, no matter what kind of environment he was in. In fact, in first chapter, John, verse 13 and 35, in John 13, verse 1 through 3, Jesus Christ makes this comment and he says, because he knew where he had come from and where he was going. He picked up a towel, put it on his arm, and served. It is a strong sense of spiritual identity that gets us to serve the most undeserving, to help the most undeserving. The place of a Christian is one where the light of Christ shines the brightest in our weaknesses. With an honest Christian that is battling with real life problems and not getting beaten down by them. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2:16, who is sufficient for these things? The New Living Translation puts us, who is adequate for such a task? Which of us are adequate for this task? Who's good enough? And Paul would conclude and say, no one is. No one is. But he makes it clear. He says, Christ is our adequacy. In Christ, we find our adequacy. When we are serving in such difficult times, when late at night you are sitting down with your family, getting ready to have a meal, and you get called and asked, we need some rice because we are feeding 50 odd or 60 children tomorrow. Can you help? Like Jesus Christ speaks in Luke chapter 11, he says, we get up and we take food so that God is honored. It's important for us to hear that we must not be discouraged. We must not be discouraged. Like Paul said, we do not lose heart. And then he finishes in verse 16 by saying, again, we do not lose heart. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4. It's easy to lose heart. It's easy when we look at what's happening in Natal. It's easy to lose heart when we watch how criminality is given free rein. It's easy to watch how the righteous is crucified and the unrighteous and the wicked is elevated. But in verse 6, Paul says, I'm afflicted, but I'm perplexed and I'm persecuted. I'm struck down. What Paul was saying, it's difficult times that we are in, but giving up is not an option. Running away from God is not the option. Trying to give up what you have is not the option. And then he touches on something very important. He says, we are jars of clay. And here it is that you must know who you are or what you are. Know what you are, that you're but a vessel of God. The other day we had a wonderful birthday for my son. It was his birthday, and Ruan bought him a box from Take-A-Lot, and inside of there was a packet of chips and all the nice goodies that he absolutely enjoyed. And here was this massive box from Take-A-Lot, and he looked at it, and he saw this huge box. And then when he opened it up, he saw this incredible package inside of it, what was just meant for him. Willem enjoyed it so much. And guess what he did was he discarded the box because its purpose of carrying that precious message and precious gifts has been done. It's finished. In the same way Paul would say, that's exactly who we are. We're not very special. We're but a cardboard box of God that just carries the message of the gospel. And if you say that I'm nothing, that's cool. But it's not about me, but it's about the message of Christ. If you want to look at websites that will tell you that how you can become good enough, it will give you all the advice in the world, but all of them are carnal. One of the advice is quite ironically interesting, where the guy would say, what you need to do is to get up every morning and tell yourself just how special you are. I'm not trying to be funny, but I have done that for a little while, looking myself in the mirror and saying, my wife, I said, I want to tell you that I agree with you for falling in love with me. Because if I was a woman, I'd do the same. And you know that sometimes when people can handle it once, twice, 3 times, but after about the 4th, 5th time, I think they'd be very worried about you. Quite rightly so. They think you're a bit touched. Self-affirmation has its place. But you know what? The key behind it is the gospel of Christ says it all. The fact that Jesus would have left heaven to mediate an agreement between you and I and set up a new covenant between us and God, discarding what we deserved, taking it on himself and saying, Lord, I'm yours. Why? Because you have affirmed my innate value of my soul by leaving heaven for me, dying on that cross for me, letting me live a new life for you, equivalent to Jesus Christ with an inheritance in heaven. Now that blows your mind. And so it's cool what people think. That you're not inadequate? Absolutely. In this world, yes. But in the world to come, in the world that I'm living currently under the kingdom reign of Jesus Christ, I know who I am. We know the struggles of Paul that he battled 3 times to speak to God about the inadequacies and the thorn in his flesh. Paul battled, but one thing he did know from Jesus Christ, and the message is clear, that Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you. In other words, what Jesus says, if you ask me how much I loved you, I love you more than my own life. And brethren, when you look at that story unfolding for Paul, Paul changes. And then he changes and he has a kopskuif, a paradigm shift. Because God says to him, my grace is sufficient for you. And then he says this totally counterintuitive statement. He says, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Which then led Paul to say, if that's the case, Lord, let me boast more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Our feelings of inadequacies are cancelled. And God affirms our value, not only in this life to carry this precious message of the gospel, but also to tell us the reason why I'm using you is so that you can understand what it is to be redeemed. Not by yourself, but by the power of God. Philippians 4:12, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, living in plenty or in want. And then he says these things, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And here it is, brethren. Yes, we are jars of clay. And yes, we accept that many of us have left recently, Achim. And we understand all of that. But we understand that it's not in the jar of clay that you need to look at and evaluate, but in the value of the message and the power of the gospel that lives and raises up sinful man and gives them significance and adequacies in Christ. And so therefore we can comfortably say to them, in Christ we are more than adequate. I pray this morning that in these difficult times when you are sitting with tremendous challenges, tremendous feelings warring against your soul, your mind playing mind games with you, you're feeling very discouraged. Know this, that the God who has called you has promised, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. And the response from us is, and so I will glory in God, and I will not fear what any man can do to me. No man can touch you. No man can take your soul. And if you've got to fear someone, you better fear Jesus, who can throw both body and soul into eternal perdition. Let's stand and sing our final song for this morning, and I pray that this was of a great encouragement to you.